The night was a moonless black, and the narrow two-lane road seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. Jenna gripped the steering wheel of her beat-up sedan, her knuckles white with tension. Her GPS had gone offline an hour ago, leaving her utterly alone in the wilderness of a backwoods route she couldn't remember choosing. She was returning from a weekend work conference, tired but eager to get home. She hadn't passed another car in at least 30 minutes, and the hum of the engine was the only sound to break the oppressive silence. Dense woods flanked the road on both sides, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Her headlights carved weak tunnels through the darkness, illuminating little beyond the immediate stretch of asphalt. She felt her stomach tighten when she spotted a crudely painted sign nailed to a tree. "Turn around!" Jenna laughed nervously, shaking her head. A prank, she thought. Just some bored kids messing with drivers. Still, she couldn't ignore the chill that crept up her spine. As she rounded a bend, something darted across the road. She slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, she thought she'd hit it. A deer, maybe? No, too small. She strained her eyes, but saw nothing except an eerie rustling in the bushes. When she started driving again, she noticed her hands were trembling. The uneasy feeling clung to her like a damp fog, and she found herself scanning the road obsessively, certain that something was watching her. The car's clock glowed 1 to 17 a.m. She had no cell signal, no way of knowing how far the next town was, and an ever-growing sense that she was being followed. 10 minutes later, she saw another sign, this one standing crooked in the dirt along the shoulder. It read, "Shaw, Last Chance." Shaw, there was no indication of what it meant or who had left it there, but the paint was fresh enough to glisten faintly in her high beams. She swallowed hard, considering her options. There weren't many. The car's gas gauge hovered just above empty, and doubling back didn't seem wise. She pressed forward, telling herself she was just tired, just imagining things. Then her radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a faint, garbled voice. She reached for the dial to turn it off, but the voice grew louder, though the words remained incomprehensible. A man's voice, low, guttural, and wet, like someone gurgling blood. Her skin crawled, and she punched the power button. The static stopped, leaving the silence even more oppressive. She passed another sign. "Sir, you were warned." Her breath hitched, but she kept driving. Turning around would mean pulling into the woods, and every primal instinct in her body screamed at her not to stop. She pressed the accelerator, pushing her old sedan harder than it liked, the engine protesting with a metallic groan. That's when she saw the car. At first, it was just a flicker of red taillights far in the distance. Relief flooded her. Finally, another driver. But as she gained on it, her relief morphed into unease. The car was an old muscle car, matte black with deep dents in the rear bumper. Its taillights flickered, as though shorting out. Jenna slowed down, maintaining her distance, her fingers twitching with the urge to honk and signal the driver. Something about it didn't feel right. Without warning, the car swerved violently, as if to block the road. Jenna braked hard, her tires screeching on the asphalt. Her headlights illuminated the muscle car's rear windshield, which was smeared with some dark substance. Was it blood? The driver's side door swung open, but no one stepped out. Instead, the interior light revealed the cabin, completely empty. Her breath caught in her throat as the muscle car's taillights blinked off. The world plunged back into darkness, save for her own headlights. And then, she saw it, movement in her rearview mirror. A shadow, lanky and distorted, darting across the road behind her car. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Before she could react, something struck the sedan's back window, a loud, bone-rattling thud. She screamed, jerking the wheel as her car skidded. The window didn't shatter, but a web of cracks blossomed across the glass. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The muscle car's headlights flared on suddenly, blindingly bright in her rearview mirror. It roared to life and began closing in, its engine snarling like a beast. Jenna floored the gas pedal, her sedan whining in protest as it struggled to pick up speed. The black car gained on her easily, its grille now inches from her bumper. It nudged her, just enough to send her car fishtailing. She screamed again, gripping the wheel as she fought for control. Her tires skidded dangerously close to the shoulder, where the woods loomed like a hungry maw. And then it stopped. The muscle car fell back, its headlights flickering before vanishing altogether, swallowed by the darkness. Jenna didn't slow down, not for a second. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths as tears streamed down her face. She didn't know how far she drove before she saw it, the faint glow of a gas station's neon sign. Her relief was so overwhelming that her hands shook violently as she pulled into the lot. The station was eerily quiet, a single pump illuminated under a buzzing fluorescent light. She stumbled out of the car, looking around frantically for someone. Anyone. The attendant emerged from the building, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He gave her a long, skeptical look as she babbled incoherently about the black car and the shadow in the woods. His face darkened. "You're lucky," he muttered. "Most folks don't make it past Deadman's Bend. They get run off the road, or worse." Jenna's stomach twisted as she followed his gaze to her car. The cracked rear window was smeared with handprints. Long, claw-like fingers dragged down the glass, leaving streaks of something dark and viscous. The man took a drag of his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Whatever you saw out there," he said, voice low, "you better hope it didn't follow you. Ungrer." Late one October night, Mike and Lisa were driving through the Appalachian Mountains on their way to visit friends. Their GPS had led them off the interstate hours ago, and they now found themselves on a winding, desolate road that seemed to coil tighter around the peaks with each mile. The dense trees on either side pressed in, and the faint fog snaking through the underbrush made the headlights seem weaker than they should have been. The couple barely spoke, both feeling a tension neither wanted to admit. The road was poorly maintained, riddled with potholes and cracks, and the farther they went, the less it seemed like anyone had traveled it in years. At one point, they passed a battered old mailbox leaning at a crooked angle, but there were no houses in sight. Then they saw the figure Lisa was the first to notice. A man, or at least what she thought was a man, was standing in the ditch on the side of the road, leaning heavily against a bent walking stick. His face was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, and his clothes hung loosely from his wiry frame, caked in mud. He didn't signal for help or even look at them as the car passed. He simply stood there, head slightly bowed, as if waiting for something. Lisa turned to Mike, her voice low. "Did you see him?" Mike nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah. Didn't look like he wanted a ride." Lisa shuddered and glanced at the side mirror, but the man was already swallowed by the darkness. She didn't like how he hadn't moved, not even a twitch, as their car sped by. The road seemed endless. They passed no signs, no intersections, and no other cars. Just when Lisa was about to suggest turning around, the figure appeared again. This time, he was standing on the shoulder ahead in the same slumped posture as if they'd never passed him. Mike slowed the car, his mouth dry. "How? That's not possible." Lisa didn't respond. Her chest tightened and her heart drummed against her ribs. As they neared the man, she noticed something strange. His skin, visible beneath the ragged sleeves of his shirt, was pale and waxy, almost translucent. And his hat, it wasn't just covering his face, it seemed to cast an unnatural shadow over his entire upper body, even in the direct beam of the headlights. Mike pressed the gas pedal, speeding past him without a word. This time, Lisa didn't look back. The road twisted again, climbing higher into the hills. The car's engine whined as it struggled with the incline. Then it happened, a loud metallic clang from beneath the hood. The dashboard lights flickered and the car coasted to a stop. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, slamming his fist on the wheel. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "What do we do?" Mike popped the hood and grabbed his flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Lisa's hands trembled as she locked the doors behind him. She watched him through the windshield as he disappeared behind the raised hood. Outside, the forest loomed, eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Minutes passed. Then, just as she was about to call out to him, she saw movement. A shadow shifted in the trees, tall, thin, and deliberate. Lisa froze, her eyes darting toward Mike. He was still fiddling with something under the hood, oblivious to the figure now standing just at the edge of the tree line. "Mike!" she hissed, rolling down the window a crack. "What?" he called back, annoyed. "Get back in the car. Now." "What are you talking about?" He didn't even glance up. She didn't answer, too terrified to take her eyes off the figure. It wasn't moving anymore, but she could see it more clearly now. It was the man, still gripping his crooked stick. Only now he wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Lisa screamed. Mike finally looked up and turned toward the woods. She saw his flashlight beam sweep across the figures and then sputter out. "Lisa!" he shouted, his voice rising in panic. He bolted for the driver's side door, yanking it open and throwing himself inside. "Lock it! Lock everything!" "What's happening?" Lisa cried, her voice trembling as she mashed the lock button again and again. They were right there," Mike stammered, staring wild-eyed at the windshield. "But they're gone. Just gone." As if on cue, the car's headlights flickered, and the radio crackled to life. A low, guttural voice slithered through the static, muttering in a language neither of them recognized. The temperature inside the car plummeted, their breath visible in the sudden chill. "Drive!" Lisa screamed. "Go now!" Mike turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He slammed the car into gear, peeling out with a screech. The road ahead blurred as they sped down the hill, the tires skidding dangerously around sharp turns. Then the figures appeared again. Not on the side of the road this time, but directly in front of the car. All three of them standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. "Hold on!" Mike shouted. He swerved, narrowly missing them. The car careened onto the shoulder, the tires digging into loose gravel, before he wrestled it back onto the road. Lisa was sobbing now, her hands clutching the dashboard. She dared a glance behind them and immediately regretted it. The figures were running after the car, their movements impossibly fast and inhumanly smooth. "They're catching up!" she screamed. Mike pressed the accelerator to the floor. The car groaned in protest, but it surged forward. The figures receded into the darkness behind them, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't really escaped. Hours later, they reached the safety of a small town. They pulled into the parking lot of a brightly lit diner and stumbled inside, shaken and pale. The waitress behind the counter frowned at them. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring them coffee. Mike laughed nervously. "Something like that." The waitress's expression darkened. "Y'all weren't up on Old Hollow Road, were you?" Lisa froze, her blood turning to ice. "Why?" The waitress leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say folks who see the hat men on that road don't make it out alive. If you did, you best pray they didn't follow you." Lisa and Mike exchanged a terrified glance. Outside, the diner's fluorescent lights flickered, and the shadows in the parking lot seemed to stretch just a little too far. It was supposed to be a quick trip. Jason had finished his shift late and was heading home along Route 53, a backroad shortcut he'd taken 100 times before. The road was empty, surrounded on both sides by sprawling fields that were pitch black under the cloudy sky. His car's headlights seemed almost swallowed by the darkness as they pierced the narrow path ahead. The digital clock on his dashboard blinked 2:14 a.m. when he noticed something strange. A faint glimmer of light, far off in the distance, hovered in the middle of the road. He squinted, leaning closer to the windshield. At first, he thought it was another car, but as he got closer, the light didn't grow or shift. It just floated there, unnervingly still. Jason slowed down, unsure of what he was seeing. When he was about 50 feet away, he realized it wasn't a car, it was a lantern. An old-fashioned glass and metal lantern, swaying slightly as though it were being held by someone just out of sight. He hit the brakes and brought the car to a stop, staring at the strange light. There was no one around, no movement, just the lantern glowing dimly. He considered driving around it, but something about the way it hung in the air, suspended unnaturally high off the ground, made him hesitate. That was when he saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the road, stepping into the glow of the lantern. It was a woman, barefoot, with long, tangled hair hanging over her face. She wore a tattered white dress that was stained with something dark, mud, or maybe blood. Jason's throat tightened as she turned her head toward him, revealing empty black sockets where her eyes should have been. His foot slammed on the gas instinctively, but the car didn't move. The engine sputtered and whined as though something was holding it in place. The woman started walking toward him, slow and deliberate. Jason's heart pounded as he yanked the gear shift, trying to get the car to respond, but the tires wouldn't budge. The woman stopped just a few feet from the hood of the car. Jason dared to meet her gaze, or where her gaze should have been. Her head tilted unnaturally as though she were studying him, and then her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Slowly, she raised one hand and pointed behind him. Jason didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his eyes forward, to stay focused on the woman in front of him. But curiosity, or maybe fear, overpowered him. His head turned, and he glanced into the rearview mirror. There was something in the back seat. It was hunched low, a shadowy figure with long, spindly arms that ended in clawed fingers. Its face was a nightmare, a gaping maw of jagged teeth surrounded by tattered skin as though its face had been shredded and left to rot. The creature's breath fogged the glass, its head tilting in jerky, unnatural movements as it studied Jason from the shadows. Jason screamed, throwing open the driver's side door and tumbling out onto the road. The air was icy, sharp against his lungs as he scrambled to his feet. When he looked back at the car, the lantern was gone. The woman was gone. The shadow in the back seat was gone. The engine roared to life, but Jason hadn't touched it. The headlights blinked once, twice, and then the car began to roll forward, slowly at first, then picking up speed. It veered wildly, lurching left and right as though something unseen were yanking the wheel. And then it stopped. Jason froze, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he watched. The car sat there, idling, the red glow of its taillights casting long shadows over the empty road. For a moment, everything was still, silent. Then the back door opened. A figure stepped out of the car, a man, but horribly wrong. His limbs were too long, bending in ways they shouldn't. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes burned with a pale, sickly light that seemed to pierce right through Jason. The man, or the thing, stared at him, grinning with teeth too sharp, too numerous. Jason turned and ran. The darkness swallowed him as he sprinted down the road, the gravel tearing at his shoes. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. The air grew colder, his breath frosting in front of him as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. In the distance, he saw a faint glow. A gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly against the oppressive night. Jason forced himself toward it, hope blooming in his chest. He stumbled through the station's doors, gasping for air, and collapsed against the counter. The clerk looked up from his magazine, startled. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jason couldn't speak, couldn't form the words. He just pointed toward the road, his hands trembling violently. The clerk frowned and walked to the window, peering out into the night. "Ain't nothing out there," he said, turning back toward Jason. "You sure you're—" The lights flickered. The clerk stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. Jason turned slowly, following the man's gaze, but the thing was standing outside, just beyond the glow of the gas station lights. Its grin widened as it raised one clawed hand, dragging a finger across its throat in a slow, deliberate motion. Then it turned and melted into the darkness. Jason never drove Route 53 again. But sometimes, late at night, when he was home and thought he was safe, he swore he could hear footsteps outside his window. And once, just once, he thought he saw the faint glow of a lantern flickering in the distance. It was past midnight when Claire pulled her car onto a lonely, unmarked road in the middle of nowhere. The shortcut had seemed like a good idea earlier, a way to shave off time on her long drive home. But now, surrounded by towering pine trees that swallowed her headlights, she was beginning to regret it. The road was narrow and poorly paved, cracking in places with weeds sprouting through the asphalt. Her GPS had stopped working 20 minutes ago, and her cell phone had lost signal even earlier. The only sounds were the crunch of her tires on the gravel and the faint hum of her engine. As she rounded a curve, she spotted something ahead, a faint figure standing in the middle of the road. Claire slowed down, her breath catching in her throat. At first, she thought it was an animal, but as her car inched closer, she realized it was a person. A woman, barefoot and wearing a pale dress, stood motionless, staring at the car. Claire stopped completely, gripping the steering wheel. She debated what to do. The woman didn't move, didn't wave for help, didn't look away. She just stood there, her face hidden in shadows. Claire rolled down her window slightly, her voice shaky. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman tilted her head, as if she didn't understand the words. Then she pointed, one thin, bony finger directing Claire's gaze to the side of the road. Following the motion, Claire's headlights revealed a second figure, a man crouching low in the tall grass, his eyes glinting unnaturally in the light. He grinned when he saw her, his teeth unnervingly sharp. Panic surged through her, and Claire slammed her foot on the gas. The car roared forward, and the woman jumped back just in time to avoid being hit. Claire didn't look back as the figures disappeared into the darkness. She drove fast, her heart hammering back, glancing at her mirrors every few seconds. The road seemed endless, the towering trees blending together in a disorienting blur. Just as she began to calm down, her headlights caught movement up ahead. Another figure. This one was kneeling in the road, its back to her. Claire's stomach dropped. Her mind raced. Was it the same man? A new person? Was it a trap? Her hands trembled on the wheel as she debated what to do. She couldn't keep stopping. She couldn't risk another encounter. She honked the horn, hoping the sound would scare them away, but the figure didn't move. It just stayed there, unmoving, as if it hadn't heard her at all. "Move," she yelled, her voice cracking with fear. The figure rose slowly, unnaturally, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. It turned to face her, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a person. Not really. Its face was wrong, stretched and distorted, its eyes hollow sockets that seemed to draw the light out of the air. The thing took a step toward her car. Claire screamed and hit the gas, swerving around it. She didn't care if she ran off the road, she just needed to get away. The car jolted as it clipped the edge of the ditch, but she managed to straighten it out, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. The figure disappeared in her rearview mirror, but she didn't slow down. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing denser, the darkness thicker. Her headlights began to flicker. "No, no, no," she muttered, her voice trembling as she slapped the dashboard. The lights dimmed, then blinked out entirely. She slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. Her world was plunged into total blackness, the forest eerily silent around her. Claire fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as she tried to calm herself, her ears straining for any sound. Then she heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap coming from outside the car. Her eyes darted to the windows, but the darkness was so complete she couldn't see anything. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one side of the car to the other. She locked the doors, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Who's there?" she yelled, her voice breaking. The tapping stopped. A moment of silence passed. Then something slammed against the driver's side window, hard enough to shake the car. Claire screamed, her hands flying up to shield her face. When she dared to look, the window was covered in long, jagged scratches, as if something had dragged claws across the glass. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Claire sat frozen, too scared to move, her mind racing with what to do. Then, slowly, the passenger door creaked open. Her blood turned to ice. The seat beside her dipped as if someone or something had climbed in. She didn't turn her head, she didn't dare, but she could feel it sitting there, its presence heavy, its breath cold against her neck. A low, guttural voice whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have stopped." Claire screamed and slammed her foot on the gas. The car surged forward, its headlights flickering back to life. She drove blindly, tears streaming down her face, the engine roaring as she pushed it to its limit. She didn't care where the road led. She just needed to get away. Eventually, she saw lights in the distance. A small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. She pulled into the lot, tires screeching, and stumbled out of the car. Her legs felt like jelly as she ran inside. The waitress behind the counter looked up in surprise. "Are you okay?" she asked. Claire shook her head, too panicked to speak. She turned back to the door, expecting to see something, anything, following her. But the lot was empty. The road was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had climbed into her car was still with her, hiding just out of sight, waiting for her to let her guard down. And she never drove that road again. It was a cold, moonless night when Eric took the long drive back home from his brother's cabin in the woods. He had stayed too late, drinking and catching up, and now he regretted it as the twisting country roads stretched endlessly before him. The air felt heavy, pressing against the windshield as though the night itself wanted him to stop. His headlights illuminated the narrow road ahead, bordered by dense trees that swayed faintly in the wind. The clock on his dashboard glowed 1:47 a.m. He turned on the radio to cut through the oppressive silence, but all he got was static. He flipped through the channels, but no music or voices broke through the crackling hum. He was alone out here. Or so he thought. About 10 minutes later, he spotted something up ahead. A car sitting on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking faintly. It was an old, beat-up sedan, its paint peeling and its tires caked in mud. As Eric slowed down, he saw a man standing beside the car, waving his arms. Eric's instincts told him to keep driving. Something about the scene felt off. The man was dressed in a thin, tattered coat despite the cold, and his face was obscured by the shadows. But the way he waved, it was frantic, almost desperate. Against his better judgment, Eric rolled down his window slightly as he pulled up beside the man. "Need help? Need help?" he called out. The man stepped closer, and Eric could finally see his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes looked wrong, too wide, with pupils that seemed to swallow up the whites. He didn't smile or nod. He just pointed down the road. "There's something," the man said, his voice hollow and uneven. "Something in the trees. It's following me." Eric frowned. "What are you talking about? Do you need me to call someone?" The man shook his head violently. "No. No phones. It doesn't like phones." His gaze darted nervously toward the woods. "You can't stop. You have to keep going. If you stop, it sees you." Eric felt a chill creep down his spine. "What sees you?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but then his expression changed. His eyes went wide with terror, and he stumbled backward, pointing frantically toward the woods. "It's here," he whispered. "It's here!" Without thinking, Eric rolled up his window and floored the gas. The man's panicked shouts faded into the night as the car sped away, tires kicking up gravel. Eric's heart pounded as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He told himself the man was crazy. Maybe on drugs. There was nothing in the woods, just trees and shadows. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced at the rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the road. Something was running behind his car. At first, he thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a large dog, but it was too fast, too fluid. The way it moved wasn't natural. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face, if it had one, was hidden in darkness. Eric pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine roaring as the car picked up speed. The thing didn't slow down. If anything, it was getting closer. Its movements became more erratic, its limbs twisting and bending in impossible ways as it sprinted after him. Come on, Eric muttered, his voice trembling as he glanced at the speedometer. He was doing 70 now, but the creature was still keeping pace. Then the headlights flickered. No, Eric groaned, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The lights dimmed, then came back on, but the brief darkness was enough. When the road reappeared, the creature was no longer behind him. It was in front of the car. Eric screamed and swerved, narrowly missing the figure as it lunged at the windshield. The car skidded off the road, bouncing over the uneven ground before slamming to a stop against a tree. The impact knocked the breath out of him, and for a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. When he opened his eyes, the creature was gone. The woods around him were silent, the air still. He fumbled with his seatbelt and pushed open the door, stumbling out into the cold night. The front of his car was crumpled, steam hissing from the hood. Eric reached for his phone, but it was dead. Of course it was. He cursed under his breath and looked around, hoping to see lights from a nearby house or another car. But the road was empty, stretching into the darkness. Then he heard it. A soft, rustling sound, like leaves being brushed aside. It came from the woods, just beyond the faint glow of his headlights. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. He didn't know why he said it. He didn't want an answer. The rustling grew louder, closer. Eric backed up against the car, his breath fogging in the cold air. His eyes darted between the trees, searching for the source of the noise. And then he saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They blinked, one by one, as though acknowledging him, and then they started to move. Eric didn't wait to see what they were. He climbed back into the car, ignoring the way his hands trembled as he turned the key. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. He tried again, his movements frantic, and this time the car roared to life. The creatures were closer now, their pale, twisted forms emerging from the woods. They moved on all fours, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Their faces were blank, featureless, except for those glowing eyes. Eric slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning in the mud before catching traction. He backed onto the road and floored the gas, not caring about the damage to the engine or the noise it made. He just needed to get away. The creatures didn't follow him onto the road. They stopped at the edge of the trees, their eyes watching him as he disappeared into the night. When Eric finally reached civilization, He pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station and collapsed against the steering wheel, shaking. He tried to explain what had happened to the attendant inside, but the words wouldn't come. All he knew was that he would never, ever take that road again. The gas gauge was dipping close to empty, and Lily cursed herself for not stopping at the last station she passed. She was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless miles of farmland on either side of the narrow road. The night was impossibly dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Her headlights seemed to barely make a dent in the oppressive blackness. The road stretched on endlessly, unbroken by houses or streetlights. The only sounds were the low hum of her engine and the occasional thump of gravel kicked up by her tires. She gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Something about this stretch of road felt wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Then, up ahead, she saw it. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, motionless. Lily's heart jumped, and she instinctively slowed down, squinting to make out what she was seeing. It was a man, tall, with broad shoulders and unnaturally long arms. His head was tilted to one side, as though he were studying her approach. She stopped the car about 20 feet away, her pulse pounding in her ears. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her, though his face was obscured by the shadows. Lily honked the horn, hoping to scare him off, or at least signal for him to move. He didn't flinch. Her instincts screamed at her to back up and turn around, but there was something about the way he stood, unnatural, almost menacing, that kept her frozen in place. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like he was waiting for her to make the first move. Finally, she took a deep breath and rolled down her window just a crack. "Hey!" she shouted. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He just raised one hand and pointed behind her. Lily's stomach churned as she glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, she didn't see anything. But then, far in the distance, she noticed faint lights. They looked like headlights, two small points of light that seemed to hover unnaturally, growing larger as they approached. Something about those lights wasn't right. They weren't bobbing like normal headlights would on a bumpy road. They were steady, perfectly aligned, almost as though they were floating. The man in the road lowered his hand and Lily's attention snapped back to him. She had the distinct feeling that whatever was behind her, he was warning her to get away from it. Screw this, she thought, throwing the car into reverse. She glanced back again, but the lights were gone. The road behind her was pitch black, as if the headlights had never been there. Her hands trembled as she shifted back into drive. "Just keep going," she whispered to herself. "Don't look back." The man stepped aside as her car slowly rolled forward. She kept her eyes on him as she passed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. For a split second, she thought she saw his face, a pale, gaunt mask with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide into a sharp, jagged grin. Lily hit the gas, her foot trembling on the pedal. The car surged forward, and she didn't dare look back again. But as she sped down the road, she began to notice something strange. The darkness around her seemed to press closer, swallowing the edges of her headlights. The trees lining the road bent unnaturally, their twisted branches reaching toward her car. The radio crackled to life, emitting a faint, distorted voice that sent chills down her spine. She hadn't turned it on. "Don't stop," the voice hissed. "Keep driving." She slammed her hand against the power button, but the voice continued, growing louder. "Don't look. Don't stop. Don't." The radio cut out, leaving her in silence. Her chest tightened, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Then she saw the lights again. They were closer this time, impossibly fast, chasing her down the narrow road. They weren't headlights. They weren't even human. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace, glowing brighter and brighter as they closed the distance. Lily pressed the gas pedal to the floor, her car hurtling down the road. The lights followed, weaving back and forth like a predator playing with its prey. She could feel the presence of something behind her, something massive and ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. Her rearview mirror shattered suddenly, as if something had struck it from behind. She screamed, but she didn't slow down. Her car groaned and shook, the engine protesting against the strain. Ahead, she saw a faint glow. A gas station, its fluorescent lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. She didn't think. She just drove straight for it, her tires screeching as she veered into the lot. The car skidded to a stop, and she jumped out, running toward the bright lights of the station. She pounded on the locked door, yelling for help, but no one appeared. When she turned back toward the road, the darkness seemed to recoil, retreating into the distance. Whatever had been chasing her was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it was still out there, watching, waiting for her to leave the safety of the light. She didn't go home that night. Instead, she sat on the curb of the gas station, staring into the black abyss of the road, too terrified to move until the sun finally rose. The rain was coming down in relentless sheets, hammering against Daniel's windshield as his wipers struggled to keep up. The highway was almost deserted, the occasional flash of headlights from the opposite direction his only company. He had been driving for hours, pushing through the storm, desperate to reach his destination before dawn. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught a sign, "Rest area ahead, 1 mile." Relieved, he decided to pull over for a quick break. The storm and the isolation were getting to him, and he figured a few minutes to stretch his legs would help. The rest stop was eerily quiet when he pulled in. The fluorescent lights above the parking lot buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the wet asphalt. The small building housing the bathroom stood in the middle of the lot, its white paint streaked with grime. There was only one other car, an old station wagon, parked at the far end. It looked abandoned, its windows fogged over. Daniel hesitated. Something about the scene felt off, but he brushed it aside. It was late. He was tired, and his mind was probably playing tricks on him. He parked close to the building and jogged through the rain to the men's restroom. The air inside was cold and damp, the walls streaked with water stains. One of the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows. He hurried through his business, washing his hands quickly yet eager to get back on the road. As he turned toward the door, he froze. A pair of wet footprints, bare and too large to be human, led from the entrance to the farthest stall. The door to the stall was slightly ajar, swinging faintly as though someone had just passed through. "Hello?" Daniel called, his voice echoing slightly. No answer. He backed toward the exit, his pulse racing. Just as he reached the door, he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging across tile. It came from the last stall. Daniel didn't wait to investigate. He bolted out into the rain, his heart hammering. As he reached his car, he glanced at the station wagon again. The windows were no longer fogged. A face, pale and distorted, stared out at him from the driver's seat. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Daniel jumped into his car and locked the doors, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the key. The engine sputtered to life, and he threw the car into reverse, backing out of the lot as fast as he could. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced in his rearview mirror. The station wagon was moving now, its headlights flickering to life. It pulled out of the lot and onto the road behind him, staying just far enough back to remain in the shadows. Daniel's hands gripped the wheel tightly as the car followed him mile after mile. He tried to shake it by speeding up, but every time he glanced in the mirror, it was still there, trailing him like a predator stalking its prey. And then, without warning, the station wagon's lights disappeared. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. A sound, a faint, wet scratching, came from the back seat. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare look, didn't dare move. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking across the upholstery. Slowly, Daniel tilted the rearview mirror down just enough to see the reflection of the back seat. It was there. A figure impossibly tall and bent, its body twisted and wet, its face blank except for hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb all light. Its mouth was a gaping void, jagged and too wide, dripping something dark and viscous. Daniel screamed and swerved, the car veering off the road and slamming into a ditch. The impact jarred him forward, his vision blurring. When he regained his senses, the car was silent, the storm pounding outside. He turned slowly, afraid of what he might see. The back seat was empty, but the door on the passenger side was open, rain pooling on the seat. And somewhere, just beyond the car, he heard it. The faint, wet sound of something crawling. The road was long, empty, and swallowed by darkness. Amy had been driving for hours, her GPS struggling to maintain a signal in the remote countryside. She was beginning to regret taking the shortcut her coworker had recommended. The endless rows of cornfields on either side of the narrow road made her feel like she was the last person on Earth. Her car's clock blinked 2:03 a.m. The only sound was the hum of her tires against the asphalt and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. She fiddled with the knob, hoping for some music to keep her company, but all she got was faint bursts of garbled voices. Frustrated, she turned it off and focused on the road ahead. Then she saw it. A figure appeared in the distance, standing on the side of the road. As her headlights swept over it, she saw it was a woman. She was wearing a long, tattered dress that fluttered in the wind, and her hair hung in wet, dark strands over her face. Amy slowed down instinctively. What was someone doing out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? As she got closer, the woman raised her hand and waved, slow, deliberate, and almost mechanical. Amy's stomach tightened. Everything about the woman screamed danger, but she couldn't just leave her out here. She rolled down her windows slightly as she pulled up alongside her. Do you need help?" Amy asked, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She stepped closer to the car, her face still hidden by her hair. Amy's pulse quickened as she noticed the woman wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were caked in mud, and there were long, dark scratches running up her legs. "Are you hurt?" Amy asked again. This time the woman slowly raised her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, deep, hollow pits of darkness, locked onto Amy's. A faint, unnatural smile spread across her lips, revealing teeth that were jagged and sharp. Amy's breath caught in her throat. She slammed the window shut and floored the gas, her car lurching forward. In her rearview mirror, she saw the woman standing in the road, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching her drive away. Amy's hands were shaking as she gripped the wheel. She kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see the woman following her. But the road was empty again, the cornfields swaying gently in the wind. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "It was just someone messing with me," she muttered, though she didn't believe it. A few minutes later, her car's headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed and the engine stuttered. No, Amy whispered, tapping the gas pedal. The car slowed to a crawl before finally sputtering to a stop. She was stranded. Amy's heart pounded as she fumbled for her phone. No signal. The darkened road stretched out in both directions, empty and silent. She debated whether to stay in the car or try walking to find help. A faint sound caught her attention, a soft rustling, like something moving through the cornfields. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Amy's breath hitched as she locked the doors and peered out into the night. The rustling stopped. Then from the darkness, a hand slammed against her window. Amy screamed, her eyes darting to the pale, twisted face pressed against the glass. It was the woman from the road, her black eyes wide with unnatural glee. She grinned, her teeth scraping against the window as she mouthed something Amy couldn't hear. The car lights flickered back on for a brief moment, illuminating the woman fully. Her body was wrong, her limbs too long, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though she were a puppet on strings. Amy didn't wait to see what would happen next. She scrambled into the passenger seat and flung open the door, running into the cornfield without thinking. The stalks were tall and thick, closing in around her as she pushed through them. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart racing as she tried to put as much distance as possible between herself and the car. But the rustling was behind her again. Faster now, louder. It was chasing her. Amy tripped over a root and fell hard onto the muddy ground. She scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with dirt and blood, and kept running. She didn't dare look back. Suddenly, the cornfield opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling farmhouse, its windows dark and its roof sagging. Amy hesitated, but the rustling was closing in. She bolted for the house, throwing herself through the creaking front door and slamming it shut behind her. The house was silent, save for her labored breathing. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. She looked around, trying to find a place to hide, when she noticed something on the floor, a trail of muddy footprints leading up the stairs. Amy's stomach turned. She hadn't been the first to come here. A loud bang came from the door. Then another. The woman was outside, trying to get in. Amy backed away, her eyes darting around the room. She spotted a staircase leading to the basement and ran for it, throwing open the door and descending into the darkness. She crouched in the corner, her back pressed against the cold, damp wall, and held her breath. The banging stopped. Silence filled the house once more. Then, slowly, she heard footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, moving through the house above her. The floorboards creaked as the steps came closer to the basement door. Amy's eyes filled with tears as the door above her opened with an agonizing creak. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob as the footsteps began descending the stairs. She could hear it breathing now, wet, labored breaths, as though it were savoring the moment. A faint, raspy voice echoed in the darkness. "I see you." The last thing Amy saw was a pair of black, hollow eyes staring at her from the shadows. Then everything went silent. The motel was the last place Megan wanted to stay, but the storm had made the highway impossible to drive. She pulled her car into the gravel lot, its tires skidding slightly on the slick surface. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly green glow over the empty lot. Lakewood Motel, vacancy. There was something unsettling about the place. It wasn't just the peeling paint or the sagging roof. It was the silence, the eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air. The storm raged around her, but the building itself seemed untouched, as though it existed in a world separate from the one she knew. The lobby was empty, except for an old man behind the counter, his face lined and expressionless. He slid a key across the counter without a word, his milky eyes never meeting hers. "Thanks," Megan muttered, taking the key and heading down the dimly lit hallway to room 6. The door creaked as she opened it, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was small and musty, with faded wallpaper and a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A bed with a sagging mattress took up most of the space, and a rusty old TV sat in the corner. Megan dropped her bag onto the bed and sighed. It was just one night, she told herself. She'd leave at first light. She showered quickly, trying to ignore the faint sound of dripping water that seemed to echo from somewhere beyond the bathroom walls. After wrapping herself in a towel, she stepped out and froze. There was something on the mirror. At first, she thought it was condensation, but the marks were too deliberate, long, jagged streaks running down the glass as though something had clawed at it from the inside. Her stomach churned as she wiped at the glass, but the marks didn't budge. They were etched into the surface. Trying to shake off the unease, Megan turned on the TV and sat on the edge of the bed. Static filled the screen, and she flipped through the channels, hoping to find some kind of signal. On the 7th click, the static stopped. The screen went black, then flickered to life. It was a grainy image of a hallway, her hallway. Megan's heart began to race as she realized she was watching the live feed of a camera. The view panned slowly, the dim light making the shadows stretch unnaturally. She watched, frozen, as the camera moved closer to her door. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, just out of focus. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The camera zoomed in slightly, and Megan could just make out its face, a pale mask with empty, hollow eyes. The figure began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. Megan's hand flew to her mouth as she realized it was coming toward her room. The screen flickered again, and the hallway was empty. A loud knock broke the silence, and Megan nearly screamed. She stared at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time. She crept toward the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the peephole. Before she could look, the doorknob began to rattle violently. Megan stumbled back, grabbing her phone and dialing 911. The line crackled, then went silent. "Hello," she whispered. "Is anyone there?" A voice responded, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." The line went dead. The rattling stopped, and the room was plunged into an oppressive silence. Megan backed into the corner, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. She couldn't bring herself to approach the door again. Then the TV flickered back on. The hallway camera feed had returned, but this time it was focused directly on her door. Megan's blood turned to ice as she saw the figure standing just outside, its head tilted toward the peephole. Slowly, it raised a hand and began scratching at the door. The sound was deafening, nails dragging across the wood in slow, deliberate strokes. Megan screamed and ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She huddled in the corner, her eyes fixed on the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. But it didn't. Instead, she heard a faint, wet sound, like breathing, coming from the shower behind her. She turned slowly, her body trembling. The shower curtain was drawn closed, but she could see a faint shadow moving behind it. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out with a trembling hand. She yanked the curtain back, but the tub was empty. The sound stopped. She turned back to the bathroom door, her relief short-lived as she noticed something new. deep scratches running down the inside of the door, the same jagged marks she had seen on the mirror. And then, from the other side of the door, came the voice again, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "You're not alone." The lights went out.